Okay, moving on to the next segment of today's show. I was actually reading an article over the weekend. I believe it was on NFL.com, and they asked a very interesting question in that article that I thought would be a good topic to discuss on this podcast. And that question was, which NFL coaches are holding their teams back the most? And basically, I'm going to tell you guys before I give you an answer how exactly I translate and interpret this question. And basically, what I think this question is asking is, what coach in the National Football League has the most talent and they just haven't been able to win with it? And I guess another way to ask this question is, which teams have been the most disappointing. And I think both questions are good to kind of throw in there, but I picked 5 coaches that, were discussed in the article, and I'm going to give you guys my opinion on if I agree if they should be on this list or not. And it's funny because I do think there were a couple coaches that were fired this past offseason that I definitely would have put on my list. So that made making this list a little harder. I definitely would have put Jason Garrett on this list if he was still the head coach of the Dallas Cowboys. I definitely would have put Freddie Kitchens on this list if he was still the head coach of the Cleveland Browns. There are a couple other coaches that come to mind. Maybe Jay Gruden. I know things really didn't work there in Washington for him. But anyway, I picked 5 coaches that I wanted to talk about, and I'm going to discuss if they're holding their team back or not. And the first coach that came to mind when this question was asked for me is Matt Patricia of the Detroit Lions. And anyone that listens to this show knows I'm not a huge believer in Matt Patricia. I think he's a very good defensive coordinator. I really respect everything he did in New England. But the thing is, this hire with the Detroit Lions, I just don't really ever see working out. I don't love the fit. And on paper, really, this team should be pretty good. And I know that could be a little weird for you guys to hear, but at the same time, even though the Detroit Lions haven't really been that successful of a franchise throughout really the last 50 years, like when you think of the Detroit Lions, you don't really think of anything successful. But at the same time, they have a lot of talent. And the way they built their team was that they hired Matt Patricia, who was the defensive coordinator in New England, and they thought that having him, leading the way, running the defense, and having an offense with Matthew Stafford, and, they've really prioritized offense in the draft by bringing in DeAndre Swift, bringing in TJ Hawkinson, bringing in Kenny Galladay, Marvin Jones, Kerryon Johnson, trying to improve that offensive line. The Detroit Lions have really tried to prioritize their offense, and on paper, that does look like a top 5, top 10, top tier offense to me. The problem is Matt Patricia, who's supposed to be the defensive genius, hasn't really been able to do that good of a job running their defense, and it hasn't really translated to wins. Now, last year, it was unfortunate that Matthew Stafford got hurt, and if he would have stayed healthy, I think the Detroit Lions, no doubt, would have finished better than what their record was. I believe it was 3-13. If Stafford stays healthy, that team was competitive in basically every game early in the season. They had a really hard-fought loss early in the season against the Kansas City Chiefs. They had a tie week 1 against the Arizona Cardinals where they had a big lead. I think if they would have ended up to hold on and win that game, the Detroit Lions season could have ended up going much differently than the way it did. But it's a big season for Matt Patricia, and I feel like when this question was asked to me, Patricia was one of the first names that came to mind as a coach that is possibly holding his team back because, once again, on paper, the fact that he's leading their defense, the fact that the amount of talent they have on the offensive side of the ball, I think the Detroit Lions should be a top-notch team, and the first person I blame for them not is their coach. Moving on to the next team. This is another team that brought in a defensive guy that has won a Super Bowl as a defensive coordinator, as a head coach. They also have a lot of talent on the offensive side of the ball, and still they haven't really been able to get the job done, and that is of course Dan Quinn and the Atlanta Falcons. I think Dan Quinn is the other coach that comes to mind for me immediately as the guy that is possibly holding his team back, and I'll tell you what I mean. It's very similar to the Detroit Lions in that the Atlanta Falcons have a true franchise quarterback in Matt Ryan. This offseason, they bring in Todd Gurley as their running back from the LA Rams, and I totally understand that Todd Gurley did look a little bit fractured in LA, especially last year, but at the same time, it's a new place. Todd Gurley went to the University of Georgia, so he's familiar with the area, and I don't think he's totally done. He did look hurt. He didn't look the same guy as he was 2 seasons ago, but at the same time, playing in Atlanta, in a new scene, in a talented offense, I think he'll be decent. Still have Julio Jones, still have Calvin Ridley, bring in Hayden Hurst from the Baltimore Ravens, and once again, similar to the Detroit Lions, Dan Quinn is a defensive coordinator that has won a Super Bowl before. He was brought in to be the head coach of the Atlanta Falcons in order to improve that defense. That's really the number one goal when you're brought in as a head coach, as a former defensive coordinator. And at the same time, this Falcon defense really hasn't been able to improve much since Dan Quinn became the head coach. The main thing for me as to why I'm so skeptical on Dan Quinn and the Atlanta Falcons, and I know a bunch of you guys are going to say, Zach, he definitely deserved to be brought back last year because the team really did fight for him towards the back end of the season. You remember they had that big road win late in the season against the 49ers, but at the same time, the last 2 seasons, the Atlanta Falcons just haven't really started off too well. This past season, they started off 1-7. There is really never an excuse to be that bad when you have the amount of talent that team has. And also, I've said this a bunch of times on this show, and I'll keep on saying it. Since Kyle Shanahan left to become the head coach of the San Francisco 49ers, the Atlanta Falcons offense has been good, but it hasn't been nearly the same elite at nearly the same elite level when they got to the Super Bowl when Kyle Shanahan was their offensive coordinator. That was also the same year that Matt Ryan won an MVP. He was that good. He was that effective. And unfortunately, since then, really, the Falcons haven't really been able to get back to that place. Another coach I wanted to bring up is Mike Tomlin of the Steelers. And I know a bunch of you guys are going to say, Zach, what are you talking about? Mike Tomlin is a coach that has won a Super Bowl. Blah, 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 blah. I got to tell you, the more I look at Mike Tomlin's career, this guy's overrated. And I understand through 13 games last year, playing without Ben Roethlisberger, he did a really good job. The Steelers were 8-5, and they were looking to make the playoffs, and they were actually in a very good position to make the playoffs. But here's all you need to know about Mike Tomlin. The Steelers were favored in each of their last 3 games and lost all 3. That can't happen. And the Steelers are a team, and I've discussed them a lot on this show, they're a team that haven't won a playoff game in 3 years. And I'm not going to say Mike Tomlin is holding them back. I just think he's an overrated coach, and I think he definitely deserves to be at least in this conversation. Everyone treats Mike Tomlin's coaching job last season as like the fact that the Steelers like won a Super Bowl or something. They didn't even make the playoffs. And I understand, Tomlin did deserve a little bit of credit for going 8-5 without Ben Roethlisberger, but once again, the team fell apart down the stretch, and we're getting totally outplayed by the Baltimore Ravens backups in Week 17. That can't happen, and I just think the fact is Mike Tomlin and the Steelers have really underachieved, at least since they got to the Super Bowl against the Green Bay Packers in 2010 in Dallas. You remember the playoff game he lost to Tim Tebow and the Broncos. You guys remember every single big game the Steelers have ever had against the New England Patriots in the playoffs. Have they ever showed up? No. And I don't know, man. I just think Mike Tomlin has really underachieved within the last 10 years. The Steelers have had plenty of seasons where they've missed the playoffs. The Steelers have had plenty of seasons where they've just absolutely collapsed down the stretch. You remember 2 years ago when they lost that game in Oakland when Ben Roethlisberger and the X-ray machine had their whole thing. You remember that game against the Chargers where they lost at home on Sunday Night Football. And then this year, that game against the Bills, their offense just really didn't look prepared at all. They've just had plenty of bad losses over the last couple seasons. I think Mike Tomlin is an overrated coach, and I would definitely not hesitate to throw him in this list. Moving on, Adam Gase of the New York Jets. I'm a Jet guy, so I think I am a good person, a guy that has a lot of good knowledge about Adam Gase, and here's my thing with him. I actually don't think the New York Jets are that far away from being a good football team. I like Sam Darnold. I will continue to say that he is the best quarterback in the AFC East. I would have him over Josh Allen. I think the Jets' offensive line is improved, but we all know Adam Gase, the rep on him and basically the rumors on him is that even though he's a very smart mind and even though he knows how to coach, he knows how to call plays, all that good stuff, he does have a lot of times he does have some trouble connecting and bonding with his players. And I think when that is the case, especially when you consider everything that went down in New York with the Jets leading up to them hiring Adam Gase, if you remember, basically Jet fans were rioting that they hired this guy, and rightfully so. This guy was already once a head coach in Miami, in the AFC East, in that same division, and that didn't work out. And the fact that Christopher Johnson would just hire this guy as the head coach and then give him power as the GM as he won a power struggle over Mike Maccagnan, that's about a year ago now. Crazy how fast time flies. I think this guy could definitely be in the conversation for holding his team back. He has a very good defensive coordinator in Greg Williams, a defense that really did overachieve last year when you consider the amount of injuries that this New York Jet team had. And at the same time, I like their talent. I don't trust their head coach. A big reason as to why I believe a lot of people are favoring teams like the Bills and the Patriots over the Jets is because of coaching. I do think that talent-wise, those three teams, aren't really that far off. So I would definitely put Adam Gase in that conversation. And then this is a name that I didn't put on this list, but a name that the article I was reading put on their list. And I wanted to get your guys' opinion on this. Matt Nagy of the Chicago Bears. And you guys know that, once again, I was very high on the Bears going into last season. I still thought they had probably the best defense in the league. I wasn't the biggest Mitchell Trubisky fan, but I did think he would be able to get the job done. Because keep in mind, 2 seasons ago, I think rightfully so, Matt Nagy won Coach of the Year. And I was just so impressed what he was able to do with Mitchell Trubisky and that Chicago Bear offense. And unfortunately, this past season, it didn't work out. And there was some rumblings in Chicago. Their fans were upset that he didn't play their starters in the preseason. You guys also remember they had a game against the LA Chargers, and the Chicago Bears are a franchise that, as we all know, over the last couple of years have had a lot of issues in their kicking game. And then if you remember that game against the Chargers, they were down 1 with 30 seconds left. And Matt Nagy kind of just had his team kneel on the ball, and Eddie Pinheiro missed the field goal as the Bears could have gotten closer to the goalpost as Pinheiro ended up missing the field goal, and the Chargers ended up winning that game. But really, besides that, I don't think Matt Nagy deserves to be on this list because in 2 years as a coach, he's had 1 really good year, and he's had 1 really bad year. And I don't think you could really expect the Chicago Bears, now that we all really deep down know what exactly Mitchell Trubisky is, it's very hard to win when that guy is your quarterback. And I don't really care how good your defense is. And Matt Nagy and the Bears last year, were they disappointing compared to preseason expectations? Absolutely. But at the same time, they still did finish 8-8, so they weren't awful. They had their moments, and their defense still was able to win them games. And that's why I think this season, they're going to be better than a lot of people expect due to the fact that whoever their quarterback is, Nick Foles or Mitchell Trubisky, they don't need that same guy, whoever that guy is, to be Brett Favre at quarterback. If he just manages the game, keeps things low-key, I think, and doesn't turn the ball over, doesn't really screw up, I think the Chicago Bears could be decent next season. And I think if the Bears flat out suck this season, then we could put Matt Nagy in this conversation as a coach that's possibly holding his team back. But at the same time, I'm just not ready to do that after, very shortly after he had 1 great season as a head coach, 1 Coach of the Year, led his team to a division title, and a playoff game, a good kick away from a playoff win, and the season prior, the Bears were in shambles. They were a last place team and really didn't have anything going for them. And even though Matt Nagy did turn that around, it was unfortunate what went down last season. But at the same time, just because he had a bad year last year, I don't think that means Matt Nagy deserves to be on this list as a coach that is holding his team back.